All right, good morning. For those that are happening to watch the video of this, I'm Dr. John Saunders, lecturer in the Communication Arts Department, and this is our final speaker in this first version of this class, Public Memory and Race in the South. And today we have Dr. Joey Watson, who's an assistant professor in the Theater, Film, and Media Arts Department here at UAH. And is also the director of a documentary on Jazzland. So, with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Watson.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. I'm really excited to get to talk to you all this morning about this. And I'm hoping that I can present the material in a way that sort of dovetails with what you all are researching, because as good rhetorical scholars and investigators, it's only after digging and living with your text for a certain amount of time to where it starts to reveal itself for you, and whether that's a speech or a monument or a marker or an amusement park, you really have to sort of do some time with it, let it marinate before you can really start to see the broader picture, of how something that is seemingly so simplistic, like an amusement park, can actually be incredibly complex and can end up being a contested site for a number of reasons. And so I will tell you that when I started out with this project, I had really no idea where the story would lead me. And that's, I think, pretty common for most documentary filmmakers. You sort of get a theme, or maybe there's a story or something that you want to kind of follow up on. You really have to be sort of an investigator in a way to be a documentary filmmaker. There's a little bit of investigative journalism that gets kind of wrapped up in some of the more, I guess, academic or scholarly work that you're doing when you're investigating a topic. And so I will tell you that when I started this project, I thought I had something very different than what I have now. And it wasn't until I spent time with the material and really let it soak in before I started really evaluating and making some critical judgments about what really is the story of Jazzland, and if it is, what people are saying it is versus what people are perceiving it is versus, I mean, there's all kinds of interesting dualities that come out of this project. But let me get going here, and I'll get you. Can you guys, John, have you shared your screen with me, or do I have screen share privileges? Awesome. So. I'm going to now share my screen. And hopefully you all will see a PowerPoint instead of me. And we'll get started. All right. Can everybody see that okay? Awesome. So so the project initially I think had a lot more to do with public memory than race, but we'll get to that in a minute, because race was sort of the mystery box for me on this project. So just a little bit of background. I know you guys have read a lot of theory. I looked over your syllabus several weeks ago, and Dr. Saunders has laid out a really, really nice sort of palette of research and how you can sort of approach these topics with different methodologies, different approaches, different takes, different ways to sort of read the text, so to speak. And I come at this from I have a scholarly background, I have a PhD, but I'm also a filmmaker. And so sometimes the scholarly background that I have coalesces, sometimes it works against each other, but these are sort of my foundations for the project theoretically. I'm a Burkehead. I'm a Burkean guy, particularly his writing on identification. I, like Dr. Saunders, I had spent a lot of time with Dr. Gray Matthews at the University of Memphis, and his area of focus was the rhetoric of community and place. And then at LSU, where I got my PhD, I spent a lot of time with more visual rhetoric. And I did a lot of performance studies work. So one of my major influences, particularly on this project, was the work of Bud Goodall, who has done some phenomenal work in ethnography. He's a legend in the communication field. He actually used to be the department chair here at UAH years ago. And then in visual rhetoric, I kind of went into the areas of Robert Harriman and Marita Sturken, who are really sort of looking at how images and video can shape public memory of events. Marita Sturken particularly writes quite a bit about the Rodney King video and some other things that really have made an lasting impressions upon us, as a country and as people. And then I spent a lot of time with toxic tourism and the work of Phaedra Paluzzo, where she was looking at eco-disaster sites, a lot of tourism studies, and a lot of urban exploration literature, because we live in a culture right now where ruination, the idea of abandoned places and abandoned spaces, and that there's a history behind these places, has really caught steam in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly with the invention of the internet, and more, easily video sharing, can be done now more than ever. And so I think that um, the resurgence, so to speak, I guess, really happened with YouTube. And if you go on Facebook, you can find groups that are Forgotten Alabama, Forgotten Tennessee, Forgotten. There's lots of sort of micro groups that look at, say, a house on the interstate that looks abandoned. Well, there's a history behind that place, and it might not be a great history. It might be one that's really kind of nasty, but one that needs to be exposed. And so these places, while they're not formally designated markers or monuments per se, they still take on an immense amount of rhetorical power for not just locals, but for anyone who is adopting a tourist gaze, or who comes into a city and sees sites like this. They do become representations for certain things. And so all of this, when I discovered Jazzland, all of this dovetailed very well with some of my documentary theory and praxis. So Bill Nichols and Stella Bruzzi really would if I were able to talk to them in person, they would have said, yes, this is a great project, you're on the right track, keep going. And the other two things I would say that have influenced me in terms of this project and the way I sort of see documentary and teaching writ large is this book called Outside Lies Magic by John Stilgoe. Stilgoe wants us to get outside. He wants us to take walks. He wants us to find things and then ask questions about how they got there. And that's essentially just sort of having that childlike imagination of letting your walk inform you and educate you. And then, of course, following up with archival research and everything to sort of complete the picture. But the inspiration comes from the walk, from being outside, from being active, from being investigative, from looking at things, and these are just critical tools, that hopefully undergraduate and graduate programs in communication prepare you to do, to become really good critical observers, of what you're hearing, but also of what you're seeing. And so that sort of dovetailed into around the same time J.J. Abrams had a very famous TED Talk about the mystery box in movies. And I just sort of adopted that for my teaching sort of methodology, in that, learning in any class is like a mystery box. You're not really sure, something's going to be there, but you're not really sure what's going to be inside. And when you unpack it, hopefully you're very excited and you learn more than you ever thought that you would, or you learn something that you never knew before, or some sort of mystery is revealed for you. And Abrams talks about how that works in certain movies, but I think it also works in the classroom as well. And so I kind of go into documentary not knowing what I'm going to get. You know, it's a mystery box. And so for me in this project, there's no question that race became the mystery box that I did not expect to find, but did. So what is this thing that I'm talking about, and why are you listening to me this morning? Um, Jazzland is titled Chasing Jazzland, and it's the name of a docu-series, and it's headed to Amazon Prime once the story is finally wrapped. We'll get to that in a minute, but I started first researching this in 2009 when I was doing some ethnographic work with the Vietnamese communities in New Orleans East. And if you've ever been to New Orleans, I know Louisiana is not Alabama. So but we are in the South writ large. So, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, some of those places I think can kind of count, at least if it's a little bit outside of the Alabama box, that Dr. Saunders is wanting you all to focus on, and for good reason. But I was doing some ethnographic work, and I had never seen this Jazzland place. I'd never heard of it. And as I was driving down the interstate, I saw these rides that were just popped up over the trees, just kind of peeking at you. But obviously, it was a place that wasn't active. And so I took notes, and when I got back to my homeland, I asked a friend there. I passed this place. It looks like an amusement park. And then the floodgates just opened up, and he started telling me about Jazzland, and he started crying when he was telling me about it. So I thought, this could be, this could be a project here. This could be something that has some legs. So I did site visits, I did interviews, I did archival research for about 10 years. I initially wanted this film to be my dissertation. At the time, this was 10 years ago, the idea of doing a film as your dissertation was, just too radical. So I had to switch gears. And then I thought maybe I have an article, maybe a book. No, maybe it's a documentary. And the deeper that I got into the material and the more that I started to unearth, I realized last year, I said, this is a docu-series. There's no way I can tell this story without breaking it up into episodic forms. And that seems to be what's most popular right now anyway. People will watch 4 episodes of something as opposed to sit through a 2.5 hour or 3 hour movie. So I decided to break it up, which of course delayed a little bit of the actual release. But hopefully I'll get to show you a little bit of it today, at least some clips from episode 1. So I'm going to talk about Jazzland in 3 ways. I'm going to talk about it as a site, S-I-T-E. I'm going to talk about it as a site, S-I-G-H-T, and I'm going to talk about it as a site, C-I-T-E, because I think it functions in all of those realms. But the site, for rhetorical purposes, would be my text, right? It's what I'm trying to sort of take apart and figure out the mechanics of. And these are some things that I kind of came away with from some initial digging on the place. So it was a theme park. It's different from an amusement park. A theme park is usually themed. It has some sort of, focus or centralized idea. And for Jazzland, it was New Orleans culture. It was New Orleans cultural history. So all of the rides, all of the attractions, all of the events, they were all stemming out of some portion of Louisiana history. It kind of became sort of a unique place for the region because there wasn't another theme park close enough. Six Flags in Houston was the other one that was anywhere near the region. So it did draw a lot of people from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, all over the Gulf region. It would attract people while it was open. But a few quotes here from some early interviews that lead us, they're clues here. One individual said that he saw Jazzland as both an economic engine, but also a failure because it didn't work. Uh, another person said Jazzland was progress for the eastern portion of New Orleans. Now that's going to become very interesting because as rhetorical scholars, we're always listening to language and words and how things are being framed. And what I discovered very clearly was that there is a language divide in terms of how local New Orleanians talk about the eastern portion of their city, which I discovered is post Katrina, somewhere around 71% African American. So, what you find in the city is that people who are white, who come from the Upper East Side or the Central Business District, more of the Bourbon Street kind of area. Those are ritzier sections of town, and they refer to it as the eastern portion of New Orleans. But if you live in the eastern part of New Orleans, you call it the East. So there's already a sort of a barrier geographically between regions of the city where this park was located. So there was already sort of a cultural stigma about New Orleans East. It's dirty, it's where crime is. Jazzland's never going to work out there because tourists aren't going to go out there. And so there was already a little bit of cultural conflict before the place was even built about whether or not it would even work. Then another person that I interviewed said that, well, Jazzland failed because of the stank of the East. And I sort of like internalized that because I wasn't quite sure what it meant, at first. And I don't want to make assumptions. So I had to pursue that and discovered that it was a sort of racial slur about residents of New Orleans East. It being a dirty part of the city, it being an undesirable part of the city, lots of blight, that kind of stuff, especially post Katrina. Um, and when the park was destroyed during Katrina, um, afterwards, it's one of the most coveted urban exploration sites in the world. It's a bucket list location for urban explorers to sneak into and video and posit all kinds of untrue history and criticism and stuff about the site. But it's kind of become a digital playground at this point, with people going in and out of there, even though they're not supposed to. But it really established a sense of community and place for New Orleans, especially for the locals living in New Orleans East. It was built in 99, it opened in 2000. It's on 150 acres. And it was the actual site. I have documentation of this in the project. It was the site where Disney was thinking of building in New Orleans before he shifted to Florida. But so already even the parcel of land has a history, attached to it when you're coming at it. But people liked it. It provided local jobs. It was a source of revenue for a while. It had an economic benefit to it. But I think more than that, it provided a place for shared memories and for experiences as you're growing up. And I think all of us have had places like that, whether it's an amusement park or a museum or, but a place that sort of becomes familiar to you, and you've spent a lot of your life there, and so you have some sort of nostalgic or emotional attachment to it. And so I think the experiential factor was big in Jazzland for the folks that were there. And lastly, it provided an image of New Orleans. You think about going to New Orleans, you don't think about that necessarily being a family trip, right? You think about New Orleans being, bead throwing and lots of drinking and great music, and you'll definitely get all those. But you don't think about taking your family, like your kids, to New Orleans. But this provided an opportunity for that, and tourists were actually going out to the park in the East while it was up and running. So there was a sort of public perception of it as well. Maybe New Orleans is a little more friendly than we initially thought. Who knows? But it provided those that attachment and those kinds of emotions, that sense of community and place, and it really represented the local. So you had this sort of localized view of what it was supposed to be and what it represented to them, and then you have a tourist gaze perspective of what they're seeing and how they're interpreting it. And of course, that's been ultimately complexified because of all of the urban explorers who have gone in there over the last 15 years. So it's really, it's changed a lot. But when it was opened, this is a map of what it used to look like. They had live shows, they had airboat rides, they had some original themed characters. Obviously, they had some merch. And so I think you really started to see the duality of this is a community resource, but it's also a commodity. We're sort of marketing our culture and our history here. If you look at some of the themes, I mean, you can see, there was Cajun country. That was where you had Jean Lafitte's pirate ship, and, Pontchartrain Beach, which I'll get to in a minute, which was a callback sort of to the previous amusement park that used to exist in New Orleans before it shut down and was torn down. And it had a couple of really cool roller coasters, so it wasn't huge. It was kind of a medium-sized park. But it provided a lot for the locals, and for the people that I've talked to about it, it's a really hot topic issue for them. They get very emotional talking about it sometimes, and for good reason. But anyway, the story moves on in the sense that Jazzland was not doing well overall financially. They had some bad managers. There was some entanglements with the mayor, which I can talk about in a minute as well. But ultimately, Jazzland declared bankruptcy, and then Six Flags took it over. And they promised the city that they would be there for 15 years. And they went in and they changed all of the themes from the local to national branding. And so that reduction of the local really hurt Jazzland Six Flags' stability. People, I think, felt less personally attached to it than when it was when it became Six Flags than when it was more localized in Jazzland. It's different when you take out something like Jean Lafitte's history, and instead you insert the Batman ride or the Looney Tunes SpongeBob area. You're going to lose something. And I think that the locals kind of felt like it was just kind of they'd lost it, so to speak. They had sold out to corporations. And then, of course, this is probably how the site is most familiar. 2005, Katrina just battered New Orleans, the levees breach, and 80% of New Orleans East is flooded or completely destroyed. Six Flags, it was just left. Jazzland was just sitting there for a little over 45 days, and in some places was inundated in under 15 feet of water. So now you have Katrina attached to this site as well. So there's a whole another layer now of how this site is affecting public memory. And so from 2005 to 2008, there was a period of time where the rides were being taken. Anything that could be salvaged was getting taken out by Six Flags before they eventually broke their contract in 2008 and declared bankruptcy. And since 2005, the site has been completely abandoned. There's been nothing done with it, and it's been sitting and decaying and causing a lot of problems for the local residents. That image is one of the first ones I found in my research, and I think it really sums up the gravity of not just Katrina, but of this particular site and how it was really destroyed. It's the power of nature. This industrial progress just wiped away, with one storm. And so it sat like this, like you see here, for 45 days while the cleanup and everything continued in other parts of the city. And so here are post-trauma, post-Katrina. And I started to look. Andy King, who was one of my former rhetoric professors, used to say, write out the cites, write out the CITEs about your text, and they really kind of become thematics, that you can sort of address or talk about. But here is what Jazzland has produced. Here is how it gets cited or talked about or used in everyday conversation since the storm, which is coincidentally New Orleanians who lived through Katrina. Most of them do not say Katrina; they will just say the storm. And you're supposed to know that they're talking about Katrina, because it's just, of all the storms they've experienced, Katrina's the one, right? So they talk about the storm instead of Katrina. But Jazzland has been embroiled in corruption because the former mayor was convicted on 8 counts of bribery. One of those was connected to Jazzland funding and money embezzlement. It represents systemic problems between civic and private enterprise, because the way the site is controlled now is the city of New Orleans owns the land, but the Industrial Development Board, the IDB, I'm telling you right now, I can tell you, I am their biggest fan. They don't like me very much because I've been poking the hornet's nest for a few years now. But the IDB is in charge of attracting developers to come in and either rebuild on the site or tear it down, or do something with it. And they haven't done anything in 16 years, so I give them a lot of flack. Consistently, I hear that it's an eyesore, that it's a reminder. Anybody who has to drive by that is instantly reminded of the trauma of Katrina and the failure of the city to really restore that site to something. Whether it returns to being an amusement park or not is moot for some people there. They just want to see something done. They want to see some kind of restoration or growth. Some people say it's just cursed land. Disney left it. It's a bad idea to build a park in that area to begin with because it's out in the east. It's a cursed piece of property, so nothing's ever going to get done with it. It's also cited as a movie set. The site did experience some movie production for a while, between 2007 and 2016. So Jurassic World, Percy Jackson, there's been several. The last one was Deepwater Horizon. It was shot there in 2016, but it's pretty much died out in terms of use for that, especially over the last year or so because of COVID. But then it's also cited as a piece of living history. It's ruination, and it's something that Mother Nature did. And so there are some who think that it needs to be respected, preserved. The urban explorers say we need to leave no footprint. We can visit it, but we don't need to touch anything. We don't need to vandalize it. We need to respect it because it's living history. And that's certainly one take that you can have on it. There are also locals who see it as a source of hope. They see it as a representation of a chance to restore something from the past or renew a commitment, to having something for the community. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is the ecological citations of it. By all accounts from the Louisiana water and conservation studies that have been going on, 60% of the area in New Orleans East by 2028 is going to be totally immersed in water. And when you look at those maps, like I have, the Jazzland site is purely in the red. I mean, it's not going to be there in another 8 to 10 years. So what do you do with this? What is it doing just sitting out there? It's absent. Jazzland is absent, but yet it's still very present, right? They have not had any sort of way to move on or to move beyond what history has surrounded the site. And so, yeah, my initial research, I walked away with this. Okay, it's a failure of this. It's lamenting the past. It's representing Katrina's ghost. It's sure, all of those things. But as I can hear my former rhetoric professors in my ear going, yeah, but so what? What's the so what? you got to find the so what. I mean, all of this is interesting, but where are you going with this? What's the, what's the what is the mystery box? So I just kind of paused and said, I need to rethink all of this, And I discovered that in both iterations, when it went from Jazzland to Six Flags, and again, this would have been so much easier to research if it had been just a monument, right? Would have had more sort of concrete attempts to have it represent something. But I found that in both iterations of the park, both when it was Jazzland and Six Flags, the Pontchartrain Beach portion remained in the design. And this clown head that's turned over here, which is a pretty iconic photograph that was taken in 2012, that's the actual clown that used to be in Pontchartrain Beach. And Pontchartrain Beach was on basically the other side of New Orleans East from the 1950s was its heyday. It was built in the 1920s, but it lasted until around 1983, 82, and it closed down because there was too much crime, there was too much riffraff, all of this coded language for basically racial undertones. And so I didn't have my finger on the pulse yet, but I was getting closer. And Mystery Box 2 was when I found Andrew Carl's book called When the Land Was Ours, How Black Beaches Became White Wealth in the Coastal South. And that book was where I discovered Lincoln Beach. And Lincoln Beach was the counter to Pontchartrain Beach. It was less than a mile away, and Lincoln Beach was all where the African Americans had to go, especially during the segregation period, but even after. Lincoln Beach was the place for African Americans to congregate. And so there was a racial division that took place amongst the amusement park or leisure activity sites in the city, which speaks to the city's racial segregation that still exists. New Orleans has, as sort of universal as it seems, I mean, everybody does get along with everybody in New Orleans for the most part, but there is a lot of racial tension that still exists in the city. And so there's sort of a front stage, backstage kind of atmosphere in New Orleans. There's the performance of front stage, and then there's sort of the grittier stuff that goes on backstage. But Lincoln Beach was built solely because an African American city council member made a plea to the city after two African American boys had drowned in Pontchartrain Beach because they had no place to swim. They also had no place to learn how to swim. So Lincoln Beach was created as sort of a mecca and a counter to Pontchartrain Beach, and it created sort of a discourse between the two sites. So when both Lincoln Beach and Pontchartrain Beach closed down, nothing amusement park wise was in New Orleans for almost 20 years until Jazzland. So now all of a sudden I started to realize, okay, building it in New Orleans East was purposeful. Building it in an area that was deemed stanky or dirty, or, it was built to be a new place where people could come and congregate and have shared experiences, and to also share some of the history of New Orleans' past. Problem was that, while Pontchartrain Beach is echoed everywhere in Jazzland's design, Lincoln Beach is nowhere. So it's almost as if that part of history wants to be completely erased from our memory, but it's still very much, Lincoln Beach is still there. I've been there, I've shot there. It's abandoned, just like Jazzland, but it's still there, and it still has a history to it as well. So once I discovered that discourse and that's what was going on, then I realized that we go back to this contested meaning, where you have this kind of, oh, it's great progress for the eastern part of New Orleans, but you also have, it's not going to make it though because it's in the stanky east. And so that sort of dichotomy remains, I think, when you talk about Jazzland. um, with people there, they will tell you that they will tell you that it was a failure, or that it was, or that it was great. So it's a very sort of black and white issue for them, but it's a very emotional topic. Many of my interviewees have cried or have gotten angry, while they've been talking about it. So it's definitely an emotional push button for many locals there. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the story about the place is still not over. So, you might even say, and John, I was thinking about this last night. You might even say that it's still in process, right? It's not even a marker of anything yet. It's still just this contested place where they're still battling over what it's going to represent, and if it's going to represent anything, or if it's going to move on to something new. Just Monday of this week, Drew Brees, retires from football and then announces that he's got a plan that he wants to propose to the IDB to change to change the land. So I'm not finished yet with the documentary because the story's not done yet. But that's sort of where I'm at. I went into it thinking this is an interesting documentary, maybe 20 minutes about a amusement park that flooded. No, this is a story about New Orleans people, and it's a story of, unfortunately, racial politics as well as social and economic politics. And Jazzland is going to be a key icon for representing however that city decides to move forward. And it'll be a huge move for the locals, because having something new there for them anyway is the same as having their house rebuilt. It was interesting talking to the people there who came back after Katrina and their houses were rebuilt versus the ones who never returned and just let their land get used and built over into something else. But the point is, something was done, right? Some kind of rebuilding was done, and that just hasn't happened with Jazzland. So it continues to be this annoyance for people, because it's not quite a memorial or a marker, but then I argue that it sort of is in its current state anyway. It's this contested place that represents a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So the story isn't quite over just yet. So let me, yeah, okay, I'm doing okay on time. I want to show you just a brief few moments from episode 1, if you'd like. Does that sound good? Hopefully you can hear this. I've never tried to play a video on a Zoom call, so we'll see. Past 15 years. Can you hear that? Awesome. The internet has seen an immense increase in memorial sites, videos, and other nostalgia on everything from dead malls to abandoned amusement parks. They are essentially eulogies. Even the most avid urban explorers seemed to only focus on the story of the park itself. And I always kept thinking, there is something more, something deeper, more interconnected than just an abandoned amusement park.
Dr. Stephen High is a professor of history and the founding member of the Center for Oral History and Digital Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. He has published extensively on deindustrialization and the post-industrial transformation of North American cities. His second area of expertise involves oral history, particularly as it relates to accounts of trauma.
Stephen wrote this book that I read at the very beginning of my Jazzland research. It was called Corporate Wasteland. I had to reach out to him because I needed to comprehend the full weight of what it meant to take on a story like Jazzland.
Well, I think there is a long history of ruin gazing, and so I guess to me the question is what's the drawing power, what's the power or the emotive power of these sites, and so I think it's really around sort of the feelings of melancholia, of loss, a sense of time passing. We often think of the sublime in terms of a natural sublime or a technological sublime. But this is very much a de-industrial sublime where we're seeing the power of destruction, the destructive power of the forces that work around us. There's an appeal to these sites, and who is drawn to these sites and why, right? So what's the underlying politics? We should all be asking ourselves, what's the politics of my being here? And I think trying to understand that and be reflexive on that is really important. And so maybe it's about getting an up close look at that, right? And getting close to history in that way. It's sort of like the last person, right? And these places are going to be gone tomorrow. So I would say it's a mix of things like that. So I don't think nostalgia is the right word for it. We often talk about nostalgia. I think sometimes we overuse that word. To me, it's almost like voyeurism, right? That we're looking upon someone else's pain. Urban explorers are expanding these, exploring these abandoned sites, but they're not, they're directing their attention away from the people who live nearby, right? And so it's an act of, yes, it's an act of engagement, but it's also, not coincidental. I think that it's not really, they're not interested in people, right? I like what you're saying about how you're coming at this through oral history and ethnography, right? So you're very much interested in people's relationships, right? How people live in and with ruination, and thinking of it as ruination, not just like ruins aren't just found, but they're actually made, and there's processes, political processes there, and I think that really changes the how we understand these sites. So it's not just aestheticizing rubble into ruin, right? But it's something more. With nostalgia, it's often used as a dismissive thing to legitimate anyone thinking that the past could be better than the present, and realizing that nostalgia could also be a critique of the present, right? That actually things may have been better. I'm really interested in how, like, when the past and the present sort of collide, or there's friction, and perhaps it allows us to see things with different eyes, right? So I think documentary film can do that too, sort of to show absence, or just shift our thinking about things that we think we know, or that we see every day, and we don't think about it. Like ruins, are an invitation to sort of engage with the past, right? Past, in the present, and often, like, ghost stories and haunted stories come in these moments of transformation. So I come across a lot of that kind of storytelling in the context of gentrification. It's always like a ghost story attached to it, and that's really like the past haunting the present.
Dr. Tracy Stevenson Schaefer is the chair of the Department of Communication Studies at LSU in Baton Rouge.
Horror is almost always about the past, about something coming back into the present. Drama is the present, and science fiction is the future. And so if there's a place that has a history, and that history has what Avery Gordon would call some sort of social violence, and there is a sense that there's something still to be done, then that place often gets described or sensed as haunted. So ghosts don't have to be real in the way that you and I would like them to be real. Oh, I saw a ghost. Ghosts are the past coming back to remind us that these things are not settled in the present. It's a visual reminder of that trauma. The haunting is not always connected to trauma, but often there's a trauma that creates the haunting. They can't possibly pass that site, that SITE site, that SIGHT site, that CITE site because it's a citation of the storm. They can't pass that site without remembering. And we think about the word remember. Remember. It's putting bodies back in the space. Remembering the almost 1,500 people who died in Katrina.
These sites are sites of, well, violence, right? And pain and hurt, and so making them into playgrounds for others is just one more insult.
I think that's why the urban explorers are going in. I mean, think about it. It's still an amusement park. That's amusing, right? What's around that corner? What's in that building? What's that sound I can hear? I wonder who created that graffiti. It's still amusing. It's still an amusement park.
I guess because it closed because of Katrina, that it must be really a symbol of sort of the state's failure, right? So it's not really it's not about sort of capital disinvestment so much. They're not, people aren't remembering because of Six Flags, whatever. It's really a Katrina story, right?
After my visit to Jazzland, I realized that it haunts, but it also hurts. And anything this complex needs more questions asked. Like, where did the idea for Jazzland come from? How did it even get built? Who were the people behind it? I realized that I wasn't going to be telling the story of Jazzland so much as chasing it.
Okay, that is that's all from my end, John. If you want to take the baton back over, I think we got a good 20-30 minutes if we want to chat, or if anybody has questions. Or I know I'm the last, but I'm probably like the one who's doing a project that's probably very different from the other people that you've had speaking. I don't know for sure, but I would assume that most of the scholarship that you've heard about or talked about has been more traditional scholarship as opposed to more creative or visual kind of research. But yeah, I think it all dovetails. I mean, certainly my time in rhetoric has informed the work that I'm doing. I mean, there's no question. So I don't know. What do you got? What do you all think? You're the first people to see some clips from episode 1. Congratulations. You're my test guinea pigs. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering about your opinions about Drew Brees kind of renewing it, because or not renewing it, he's doing something else with it. But regardless, he is addressing the ruins that are there. And there have been arguments regarding the Emmett Till grocery store, because it was left in ruins, and the owners there specifically are intentionally leaving it as ruins to address racial tensions still in Mississippi. So I'm wondering what your opinions are on renewing it, specifically not even as an amusement park.
Yeah, that's a good question. My opinion is that they need to do something with it. Anything. The debate has been over whether or not it should be restored as an amusement park or whether it should become something entirely different. I think either choice is fine. I think it just needs to get some sort of appropriation and use, because if it continues to be sort of an uncontested or a contested space, then it continues to be a way to sort of set a part of the city up as a non-desirable place to not only visit but live or be, or it really stigmatizes that area. So Drew Brees, and it's funny because it's Drew Brees and Demario Davis. Okay, so you have an African American and a Caucasian, a dual attempt. There have been multiple proposals. They want to do something totally different with it. They want to turn it into more of an environmental sort of green space garden area. So I think it's a great idea. I think that the conflict comes from several locals who live in the area and who want a place like what used to be there, something that will produce jobs or a place for the production of memories or shared experiences, more so than just another nature preserve or area, because there are several in that part of the city already. So yeah, I think I think that Drew Brees is going to get a lot of. He's probably going to get it. He's got the money behind it, and Drew Brees could be the mayor of New Orleans if in a few years if he wanted. I mean, he's that beloved by the city for good reason. But so yeah, he's probably going to get it, and I think once it gets restored, it'll open up a whole new world of politics, a new history, so to speak. It'll replace what was there. It won't erase the memory, but it'll certainly replace it visually. And I think visual is the biggest thing. If you all have traveled down there, if you take I-10 and you're going 610 I-10, if you cross over to Slidell, you're going across, the water. This is the first thing that you see when you enter New Orleans from Mississippi across the bridge. It's on your left. I mean, it's the first thing you see when you're entering the city. And so the first impression that you get is this abandoned, ruined amusement park that looks like it's out in the middle of a wilderness, out in the middle of a swamp out there. So I think there's perception issues for sure. Something, needs to be done. They need to make it something. Hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Oh, I love this part. Yeah. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Actually, a couple of things that I thought of that I think it's good that this was the final guest presentation, because the remaining few texts that we have to read and engage are all about removing and what happens with that. And when you talked about Pontchartrain Beach and Lincoln Beach, it's these racially divided spaces that when Jazzland came in, it was trying to remove that. Reminded me, there's a Latin term called memoriae damnatio, which is the damning or killing of a memory, or what Stephen Brown called mnemonicide, the killing of a memory, where you have something that you want to erase. I mean, it originally came about in Rome when they had very unpopular emperors who would build statues to themselves while they were alive. And then as soon as they were dead, the city flushed them. That's why in the bowels of the sewers of Rome, in 2007, National Geographic found all these statues of unpopular emperors when they were trying to map out the sewer system that's well over 2,000 years old. So looking at Jazzland as a type of mnemonicide, and then thinking about, well, something else is going to come in and erase this, which I can totally see them taking the parts that are there and selling them to locals, like to have a seat from the swing from Jazzland. I mean, that easily come $300 maybe. So that could be a source of revenue, but that would also put Jazzland in the homes.
Right.
So it would be a relocation of it. But I also thought about everything we've looked at this semester so far has been intentional constructions of public memory, where somebody had to fill out paperwork and go through legal loopholes to put up a monument or a monument memorial, or to build a museum and craft the narrative the way they wanted. And what we have here is more of an unintended public memory, because this is something that through its own ecology became a public memory site, as opposed to being created as a public memory site. So that idea of thinking about elements that through their own means become public memory as opposed to a memory being imposed upon it. And I think that does largely affect, especially the way the locals think about all of this, because it was never supposed to be what it is.
Yeah. And I think at one part in one of the episodes, I do this nice sort of, well, I think it's effective, but it's this interviewee that I'm talking to, and we're driving by her house, which was in New Orleans East, and it was destroyed during Katrina. And there's a new house that's built on the land now. I mean, she sold the house. She doesn't live there anymore. But we drove by there because, this is where my house used to be. This is the new house that's here now. And I said, well, does it bother you that there's somebody else living there now, that there has been sort of an erasure of what you used to have here, and she started crying, and she said, no, I'm just happy that it's being used, that it's been appropriated, that it's been, something has been rebuilt there, and this idea that when we replace with something, there's so much more or greater intentionality that's involved, when you're trying to purposefully set something new where something old used to be. Um, you know, uh, just yeah, just from an ecological perspective, it would be smart for them to do something with that land, because there's a segment of the African American population in New Orleans that's suffering right now, but they'll continue to suffer from the ecological fallout of this site that's been untouched. I mean, you have to, when you go in this place, you have to watch out for boars. There's wild boars. There's gators living in this park. All kinds of birds, because there's a wildlife sanctuary just half a mile from it. I mean, we're literally talking about, you're out there in the middle of the swamp, basically, is where this place is. And there's neighborhoods that surround the park. And so anytime it rains, everything from the park, because there's still standing water in the park. I mean, it's still there. So anytime that it rains, the neighborhoods get flooded down there, and there's destruction almost every single time, some of my interviewees were sending me pictures recently of the last rain from their neighborhood and from the Jazzland flow over, where it's coming. So something needs to be done, and there is a formal Katrina marker. It's down. That's included in the docuseries. We visit it, but it's in the lower Ninth Ward. It's right next to the levee that breached during the storm in the lower Ninth. And the lower Ninth is a pretty good jaunt from Jazzland. It's in another part of the city, but there is a memorial for Katrina there. That's the sort of sanctioned, like we were talking about. That's the intentional sort of monument. And I agree with you. I think that this has become an unexpected marker or site that carries this kind of power. I don't think anybody intended for it to be this way, but it's what nature has done, and humans failing to act, on for whatever their motivations, failing to act for it. So it's still a story that I'm living with it every day, but I'm always continually learning something about it. I like this idea of memory erasure that you mentioned. That's really very strong. I think there's a strong sentiment there from some interviewees that I had, that they really do want it just gone, because it's not that they don't want to remember Katrina. It's, they don't want to remember that it was just this failed business attempt that never, in their eyes, never found success, or never found a good, tenant, or, Jazzland left, then Six Flags, then, it's always been a struggle basically for them. Jazzland has always been a struggle and frustrating for them. So it's more than just Katrina for them that would be erased. But yeah, that's where we're at right now. Sorry if I'm rambling.
Do you think even if the site is reappropriated into something very different, to where anybody coming in from outside of New Orleans would see, hey, this is new, this is awesome, this is great? Do you think, like you had the one interviewee talking about the ghosts,
Mm-hmm.
is for New Orleans residents, is no matter what it turns into, is it always going to be, well, that's what used to be Jazzland?
Yeah, I think you'll still have some of that. I mean, obviously, I think over time, generational memory has changed, and there's another part in episode 3 where I have some business folks who are talking about putting an amusement park back is really not a good economic venture anyway right now, because amusement parks on the whole are not doing well. People, even before COVID, people weren't really going to amusement parks. Video games, people stay at home. It doesn't have the same allure as it did, say, in the 70s or 80s. Just the industry has changed. And so putting a park back out there wouldn't, it wouldn't work. It's been tried before. So I think there is some hope that if you have something different there, whether it's an esports complex or a hotel or low income housing, or, I mean, there's been over 100 proposals of, what to do with this place. I don't think it's going to erase it completely. I think you still, like most New Orleanians, if you drive down the street with them, they'll narrate the city for you, and they'll be like, well, this is a Publix now, but it used to be blah, blah, blah. I mean, you'll get that. And so I'm sure that'll probably be retained as long as the memory is there for the people who actually went there when it was open. So I think it'll be there for a while. Yeah, for sure.
Well, at least
and
for
it'll probably,
the generation now.
For the generation now.
Well, they're the ones that are going to remember.
Right.
Coming
right.
generations won't have that as a touchstone. So eventually it will work its way out of the public memory if replaced with something completely different.
Right. Which is another reason why any kind of scholarly or critical work that goes on, that's why I say that in that episode is what I had to realize, what I'm really taking on with this story, because Jazzland's not going to be there forever. And so this kind of history documentation kind of work that documentary does, it's a big responsibility, because I'm not a native New Orleanian, I'm an adopted Louisiana person. I just lived there for a long time and fell in love with it and care about it. But, I don't have the same attachments to this place that the locals do. And so it's a huge responsibility to represent their story, for me being the one who's trying to tell the story through them. It's a huge responsibility because 10 years from now, somebody's scrolling past Amazon Prime, they don't have any clue what jazz, this may be a very new thing for them, whether they're local or not, I don't know. But yeah, it's pretty heavy, complex topic for sure.
Are there any other questions? I know I jumped in with quite a bit, but does anybody else have any questions?
How many of you like going into abandoned spaces? There's always one. Yeah, a couple people. Yeah. What is it that draws you to those sites?
I just like seeing all like the past, and I haven't been into an amusement park that's been abandoned, but I feel like it'd be sick because it's just it's a weird feeling to see, like, if you ever go into the backstage at like Disney and you see all like the broken down animatronics and all that stuff. I find that as like it's awesome just because that's the stuff that people in the 90s and the 80s used to see, and now it's all just beat up and it looks torn down and stuff, and it's kind of scary, but it's like at the same time it's super interesting and also just adventure in the first place. I mean, it's awesome to adventure and see new things that you've never really experienced before. So I would love to
I
go
feel
see in
like I
the
haven't.
amusement park.
I feel like I haven't really gone anywhere super cool or crazy. Like probably just like a building is probably like the best that I've done. But I really like graffiti, and you find a whole bunch at abandoned places. So I think that's kind of one factor that really draws me in. But I've watched a couple like YouTubers who actually go and do like really crazy stuff and go to like mansions and hospitals and all that. And I like watching those, but I don't know. I might be a little too scared to do it personally to go to like a hospital, but it's still cool to watch.
I like seeing
Yeah.
things that have shown that time has passed. I really like if you were to go to the theme park, like the things you would see used to be shiny and new and now they're not. And I just think that's really cool.
Well, and that is the draw of some sites of public memory, like going to Alcatraz. I mean, it's nothing more than a tourist attraction for what used to be. It's just instead of, I mean, for a while it was abandoned and I'm sure people snuck into it. And then there was the Native American occupation that happened for a while after it was no longer a prison. But that's where you have a space that was abandoned. And then somebody thought, we can make money off this. And they figured out how to do it. Whereas many other places, nobody's figured out how to make money off of it yet. But that gets to one thing that we've talked about with markers, monuments, memorials, and museums, this financial concern that tends to be somewhere with public memory, even if it's absent because it hasn't been found yet.
Yeah, I think I remember reading back when I was pretty still deep in comm research and stuff. I remember reading some stuff about Auschwitz as well, as a tourist attraction, but also, what do we do with the decay? How do we restore Auschwitz? Do we, do we restore it to its 1940s glory, or for all bad joke aside, but how do we manage these places that have such histories but are also economic engines? They're commodities. I mean, you pay to tour Auschwitz, you pay to tour Alcatraz, I mean, you can even pay to go to Chernobyl, which I would love to do. But you can find a way. There is an economic imperative, and it's the same thing with Jazzland. It's why they're competing for proposals, to what to do with it. Disney was even looking at this place. I mean, it's a prime piece of real estate when you're first looking at it. But that economic, I guess, motivation is it blocks sometimes a lot of other uses. Like I had one interviewee who said that it should stay as it is, and we should put up safe railings and stuff like that, and we should just make it a living museum to Katrina, and people could walk through and tour the ruins, and you would stop all of the people trying to sneak in and all that. I mean, you turn it into really more of a living museum where you just sort of walk through and can observe the ruination after paying a fee and all this kind of stuff. Because I can tell you, it is like breaking out of Alcatraz to even get into that place, at least legitimately or officially, and I've been in that place now both officially and unofficially. So, I did it both ways for the documentary. It's that economic push is going to be there for sure. and it becomes such a barrier. I think a lot. Yeah.
Well, are there any final questions since we have a couple of minutes left?
I just have something to say about. I remember one time I went to a place in Chattanooga. It was an old factory, and other people in this class might have gone there before, like snuck in and stuff. And every time I go to Chattanooga, I try to get in. But sometimes, like the people who own the land now, they come in in vehicles and try to see if there's anybody coming in there. And that place, I remember going on the second floor, and it's a tall place, and there were like snakes up there and everything, and it was like that's just like the side of adventure that I love. It's just like the crazy stuff that could happen in such a weird place. It's like a factory. On the second floor, there's gonna be snakes up there. It's very interesting, and there's all the graffiti and all the documents were on the ground. And I have a few pictures, but I don't think I'll have time to pull them up. But I just wanted to throw that in there. If you ever go to Chattanooga, try to find a picture.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, we want to get in places like this because we feel that they connect us closer to history. We can maybe try to be a little closer if we can touch something, or if we can be in a room, or I remember standing in some of the offices inside Jazzland, and you could still see water lines at the very top of the wall where the water had risen, well over me. And this is a haunting thing, to be standing there and knowing that there's all this activity that used to happen here, and then there was a tragedy, and and now here I am standing here, so it's like always questioning, what are the politics of my being here? Why am I here, and what am I trying to get from it? And I think it's that we want to get close to history, especially with sites that have a history or a mythos that sort of surrounds them, as being haunted or dangerous or abandoned. Even is a it's a draw. People go, oh, it's abandoned. Ooh, I want, it's mystery. It's you're always curious as to what you're going to find. Yeah, and it's quite an experience being inside the place, for sure. And it's like I said in the film, it's haunting. It is to be in there. But I'm coming at it from an urban exploration perspective that is a little bit more of a purist, right? I mean, leave no footprint. I'm not graffitiing the walls. I'm not taking the dirty stuffed animal that's on the ground that was, part of the prize that you won in the gaming area. I don't take that stuff. Other urban explorers who have their videos posted, they do that kind of stuff, so there's a destructive impulse, I think, too, from some urban explorers. Not from me, but I think you see that for sure. Some people don't. They feel no connection to the past. They feel like this is their playground, and it's abandoned anyway, and so I can just do what I want to it. There's no consequences, right? So it's about adopting the right mindset, that adventurous, what are we going to find, but leave no footprint, and it can be, urban exploration can be dangerous. We did see wild animals. I mean, they told me that I should take a wildlife wrangler when I went in, and I didn't. It was more money, and I didn't. And so we saw some wild animals, but they didn't bother us. We didn't bother them. It was fine, but I wasn't jumping on the roller coasters and, graffitiing everything, running around like a crazy kid. I was being very respectful and very quiet. So anyway.
Well, and it also makes me wonder if Scooby-Doo was really to blame for all of our desires to go into abandoned places.
Probably. It's at least for us, probably. Yeah. For sure.
We were some of those meddling kids.
Right. Yeah. Right. There's always a mystery, right? Yeah. That needs to be solved, for sure. No question. No question.
All right. Well, we are out of time. So, Dr. Watson, thank you for your time and for all of this. It was very interesting and a really good way to have this as our last guest presentation.
Good.
Because it's going to lead us into, so what happens with the removal? What happens when sites go away? which is the final thing that we have to talk about in the class before we get to everyone's individual presentation. So thank you for that. I'll stick around if anybody has any questions for me, and if not, I will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
For the oh my gosh, the public media, what would be an example? Just any type of news story that happened in the South, or just like a news station?
Anything like that, I think what most people are going to do is pick a movie that has something to do with
Oh,
public
okay.
memory in the South.
Okay.
Watch the movie and write about, well, how did this try to capture what happened? How did this act as public memory?
Okay, that sounds good. I thought I was just thinking of like the news channels or something this whole time. So, but we can
Well,
do
that
a movie, right?
that fits within, it fits under the umbrella of, you could be talking about how a public event was captured in local news media. You could also do a documentary, you could watch a film. I wouldn't go into a TV show just because that would be way too much to deal with. But I mean, there were a few films that were discussed in our last reading that, as I was reading it, I added them to my Netflix list and have one coming in sometime towards the end of the week. So movies can also work as public memory, but like Samantha said last time, you have to take it kind of as a grain of salt, knowing that it's they're focused on telling a story more so than telling truth. So you have to take into account the dramatic elements of that.
Okay. All right. If I have any questions, I'll email you. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
See ya.